Every week, Hillsdale College President Larry P. Arnn joins Hugh Hewitt to discuss great books, great men, and great ideas. This is the Hillsdale Dialogues, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. Also at the Hillsdale College Podcast Network, check out the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, The Larry P. Arnn Show, and more, all at podcast.hillsdale.edu.
Good morning, glory, America. Bonjour, hi, Canada. I'm Hugh Hewitt in Studio North, the ReliefFactor.com studio for the Salem News Channel and my radio program way up north. And I'm joined today on the Hillsdale Dialogue and all things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu for the first time by Professor Daniel O'Toole. Professor O'Toole comes to us, I believe, from Hillsdale. Is that where we find you this morning, Professor?
Yep, up in Hillsdale.
Well, I am glad to have you on the program. I met you briefly in Hillsdale and my spring sojourn there, and we didn't really get a chance to chat. So since you're going to be a major part of my audience's life for the next half year, I wanted to get a little background on you and on political theory to begin with. So, Daniel, first walk us through, Professor O'Toole, I should say, how you ended up at Hillsdale and how you ended up in political theory and what do you teach to those young, impressionable freshmen, sophomores, et cetera.
Great. Thanks, Hugh, for having me on. Yeah, I've been listening to this show for a bit, and I like the Hillsdale Dialogue, of course. And, my wife has done a lot with you. She does the K through 12 network here. And of course, my father.
See, that's why I called you Daniel, because I call her Dr. O'Toole. So if there are two Dr. O'Tooles, you're going to be Professor O'Toole, and she's going to be Dr. O'Toole. How's that?
That's okay. I can work with that. She got her PhD before I did, and we had friends who would abuse us by making a point of properly addressing the envelope Doctor and Mister. Yeah.
So walk us through where you're from, Daniel.
Yeah. Well, I got interested in political theory in college. I was a student at Claremont McKenna College and then did my PhD at the University of Texas. I'm a Straussian. And Straussians often, we say, get the bug at some point. You discover the great books and you discover that the best way to think about the moral and political questions is through the study of political philosophy and the great works of political philosophy. And then you can't stop. I mean, it becomes a sort of lifelong preoccupation, partly because the books are so complicated and vexing that you realize one can't just understand them and kind of get a quick and easy some answers from them, but they kind of require constant focus and attention, and they're about the most important issues. And
complicated and vexing is exactly how I would describe my years with Harvey Mansfield, Nathan Tarkov, Allan Keyes, Bill Kristol, and John Gibbon. Complicated and vexing, and I thought maybe I might do what you did, and I applied. And Harvard gently told me twice, no, you're not. Go be a lawyer because you don't really get this. And so when Ken Matsui, another Claremont guy, asked, are you a Straussian? And I said, I'm not smart enough to be a Straussian. He said, that's a very Straussian thing to say.
You weren't allowed in the club. But you still are, you. That's why you've done the dialogue. You can't get away from it.
So I do love political theory. But would you explain from the professional standpoint, when a young man or woman signs up to become a student in political theory, what are they signing up for?
Well, here and elsewhere, one doesn't just sign up to be a student of political theory. One signs up to study politics more broadly, which means, of course, knowledge of history and one's own regime. But to study political theory means, in particular, to study the greatest works of political theory. And to become part of a tradition, but it's a complicated tradition because you're not just, as I was saying, handed down easy answers. In fact, when you get into it, you immediately see that the greatest of the thinkers disagree about many of the most important issues, and that a lot of the thought of the great thinkers radically challenges assumptions and prejudices that we hold today. So somebody signing up for political theory signs up to really have a lot of their most important convictions challenged. But also, the exciting part is you get to, I think, see yourself and your place in the world far more clearly than you would through the study of any other kind of social science or popular reading.
Professor, I'm going back 45 years now. I could understand Machiavelli. I got the politics, actually, because Aristotle, it's basically a Venn diagram of politics, and I got those two. Yeah. And I'm good with John Stuart Mill and Locke and all those guys. But I never got Plato.
These are humble brags, Hugh. That's not insignificant. Sorry, go ahead.
Makes me a modern guy, makes me, broken with the ancients. Yeah. But what is it? Do you start with Plato? When we started the Hillsdale Dialogues, we started with Genesis. We actually did the Old Testament with Dr. Arnn first. Do you start with Plato in the intro course?
Well, yeah, I mean, partly just by the way we break it down. We do a classical political philosophy class. And actually, I don't. I start with Aristotle's Politics. Partly, I think, maybe for the reasons why you found it more accessible. Aristotle kind of more helpfully explains what it means to say that we're political by nature. Explains, I think, our more normal conceptions of justice, and just is a little more helpful in laying out the kinds of regimes and why the regime is significant, the kind of partisan disputes. So I like to actually start with Aristotle because I think he gives a more normal picture of what political life is like.
Boy, Professor, that is so good. Aristotle is for lawyers.
Yeah.
Plato is for philosophers. Aristotle just lays it out. This is like our expert witness on how the world works. And lawyers get it. But Plato doesn't tell you anything, does he? Does he ever answer a question anywhere?
No, not really. I mean, there are answers to be found. So it's not just a pointless exercise, but you have to work for it and get it. And, it's your work. I mean, it's always the reader who ultimately has to reach conclusions by kind of carrying out a dialogue within his own soul before he is going to walk away with something concrete.
We're going to talk more about how to do that, but I want to dig in a little bit.
Sure.
You were at Claremont after Dr. Jaffa, so you must have been under the thrall of Charles Kessler, the first person I met at Harvard in 1974. Were you?
Yes. Yeah. Very close to Charles. Basically, he's really the one who got me into political thought and political philosophy, and partly just he was vastly superior to the other professors I'd taken. I mean, I guess I was a sophomore when I first took a Kessler class, and it's an exhilarating experience because he's an incredible lecturer and very deep and kind of presupposes a serious kind of knowledge on the part of the student. And I thought, okay, this is the real college experience that I'd imagined in my mind. It has this image of Oxford in the late 19th century and how, you kind of got a little taste of that, what that must have been in a Charles Kessler class.
My favorite Kessler story, I've told it before, is that both he and I imagined that we were writers in high school, and we both sent pieces to William F. Buckley for National Review. He declined to print both, but he said, you must meet. That's why we met on the first day in 1974 when we arrived on campus. Charles is much, much smarter than I am. He's really gifted, and I've heard him lecture. Well, he's a great gifted lecturer, but you can't take every class from Kessler. Who else did you have at Claremont?
We had Mark Blitz, whom you might have known at Harvard as well.
Yep.
Did you know Blitz?
No. I know who he is, but I did not know him at Harvard.
He was one of Harvey's main students, and I think taught briefly at Harvard. So Mark Blitz, Jim Nichols, and Chris Nadon were the four main political theory profs, and I really did sit in or take every political theory course I could after first Kessler and Nichols really got me interested in everything. Yeah.
And when you were at the University of Texas at Austin, who was your PhD advisor?
So Tom Pengel, a big name in the Straussian world. Tom Pengel and his wife Lorraine were two of my main teachers, and the other was Devin Stauffer.
So what did you write on as a PhD student?
My dissertation, after winding through many dissertation topics, I eventually wrote a careful commentary on Plato's Greater Hippias, which I get much abuse for from my father-in-law. So when he's on with us, we'll hear a lot about why the Greater Hippias is so much greater than the Lesser Hippias and so forth. It's a short Platonic dialogue, but it's a dialogue that is extremely dense and rich. I think, of course, I'm going to say that, but it's the dialogue on the meaning of nobility and beauty, one of these key concepts, of course, in Plato. And it's one of the dialogues in which you see a real difference between the view of the political philosopher Socrates and sophistry. And so Hippias is one of the sophists.
When we come back, I'm going to give him a softball. I'm going to ask him, I'm sure as a graduate student at Texas, he had to teach undergrad. And I know he teaches undergrads at Hillsdale College. When we come back, I'm going to ask the difference between those classrooms. Don't go anywhere. The Hillsdale Dialogue is underway. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. All the prior Hillsdale Dialogues are collected at hugh4hillsdale.com. Stay tuned. Professor O'Toole will be right back.
Hey there. Today I want to tell you about the Hillsdale K-12 Classical Education Podcast. This unique show explains how children benefit from an American classical education. Whether you're a teacher, student, or parent, you'll find something of value on the show. You'll hear from teachers and administrators from schools around the country, as well as Hillsdale professors and friends who are leading the effort to revive the American tradition of K-12 education. When you listen, you'll learn all about classical education, what it is, how to teach it, and why it matters today. And there are dozens of back episodes on specific topics, like teaching Singapore math, reading great books, and even understanding how athletics is critical to a child's development. Listen every Monday on podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.
Joining me for the first time on the Hillsdale Dialogue is Professor Daniel O'Toole, who teaches ancient political philosophy, modern political philosophy, and American political thought at Hillsdale College. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. And, of course, all of the prior dialogues going back a decade, hugh4hillsdale.com. Professor O'Toole, I told you before we went to break, I was going to ask you to compare the students you taught at Texas as a graduate assistant, teaching assistant, and those you are teaching at Hillsdale, and why you think if there's a difference, there is a difference.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I enjoyed teaching both, so I'm not gonna trash the UT students. Of course, I enjoy teaching Hillsdale students more. Maybe a school's a little bit more selective, and so there's just higher quality in that basic way. Though there were always a number at UT who were quite good as well. I think the Hillsdale students, though, are just very serious about their studies. When you're in class, they and always, a few in particular, but everyone is highly inquisitive. They're fully engaged. They ask you a ton of questions. They get that the issues matter. They push back in a way that a professor loves and desires. And of course, you get a little bit of that at UT as well, but here you get more so. They write competent papers, so it's really one of the greatest things ever to get to teach Hillsdale students.
Okay, and imagine it's your first day of class. Your first day of class. What do you tell them? And we're saying ancient political philosophy here. What do you tell them?
Right.
I always do. I teach con law, and I have 2 lectures which have got nothing to do with constitutional law and everything to do with how we got there. history. What do you do?
What do I lay out? Well, the theme in an ancient political philosophy class, but others, is to make the case for what it means to say that we are political by nature, to make the case that our fundamental concerns in this world are shaped by the regime under which we live, that our basic moral and religious assumptions are shaped by the political horizon, and then to show, secondly, that our ability to live a decent life depends upon having a decent political regime, and that political life can be extremely dangerous and fraught. So you could say one danger or one problem with Hillsdale students and students everywhere is a kind of unwillingness to take the outside world and its threats seriously. And so I like to bring that home, in particular when I begin classes. It's kind of a grim thing to do, but I think it's essential.
Well, Daniel, regimes collapse. That is one of the things that people don't understand. Empires collapse. The Russians invade. China might take another country. The regime changed in Hong Kong, much to the detriment of Hong Kong, when the Brits returned Hong Kong to the Chinese, and they lied to everyone. But regimes no regime. What, Sparta lasted 600 years? Nobody's gone longer than that, right?
Some 800. They all collapse, and that's not something that people really internalize or appreciate. And of course, it's really hard to wrap your mind around the fact that ours can and will, and maybe is in the process of coming apart. That's inevitable in politics, can be resisted to some extent, but not forever. Yeah, that's a massive theme, I think, in particular of ancient philosophy. Yeah.
Inevitability of regime change is something, I mean, do they understand what that means? Do they think that there's a civil war coming? I don't, but I think inevitability in regime change is built in.
I mean, fortunately, Hillsdale students in particular, as we like to say, know what time it is in an abstract sense. I mean, they don't, this is in some sense good, personally feel threatened by the circumstances and situation, and like to retreat from it in some way in books and religious study and so forth. But nonetheless, most of them are aware that the political situation in an abstract sense is quite fraught. But nonetheless, bringing that home, I think, is a very important thing. And showing them, of course, why that's the case in political life and why that's in a way always the case is an important part of class.
When we come back from break, we're going to talk about this book, The Republic of Plato, and the translator, Professor Allan Bloom, and why we are using this particular edition and how you can get ready. Because we've got 3 more weeks on World War I with Dr. Arnn, and we're going to go back that next week or 2 weeks from now. But then we're going to turn to the Republic for a very good reason, which is it's been a decade. Time to go back and do it again, which I think every political theorist out there will say, wow, that's way too long. I'll be right back with Professor O'Toole. Stay tuned. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Professor Daniel O'Toole, Dr. O'Toole, teaches political philosophy, ancient, modern, and American political thought at Hillsdale College. The Hillsdale Dialogues is underway. All things Hillsdale are at hillsdale.edu. All of our prior dialogues are collected at hughforhillsdale.com. Professor O'Toole, I'd like to remind Dr. Arnn that we have Pittsburgh Steelers fans listening, so we have to slow down occasionally and reset the table so that they don't get left behind. If Harvey had done that 45 years ago, I wouldn't be doing this today. But let me tell you, you Steelers fan, Socrates begins it all. He was born in 470 BC. That's what we think. Then comes Aristotle. Then comes Plato, who was born in 427 BC. Then comes Aristotle, who was born in 384 BC. They are the ancients, and the ancients hold sway and dominate until what, Professor O'Toole? Machiavelli? Is that where the break comes?
Yeah, I think that's right. That's one of the things Harvey argued, and I think correctly so. With Machiavelli, you have the first attack on imagined cities in speech, and of course Plato's Republic, which we're going to read, is the greatest example of that. So a rejection of a kind of utopian or idealistic philosophy is really the beginning of the modernity.
Now, Socrates never wrote anything down, not a word, not that we know of at least. And in fact, yesterday I was talking to a New York Times reporter, Elizabeth Diaz, about her book on abortion with Lisa Luhr, and she brought up how Islam had preserved the works of the Greeks, somewhat roundabout, but we got to that. I believe we got our Plato from the Islamic world. They preserved it. Am I right about that?
Right. Yeah. And so we only got it again in the 14th century through Constantinople. Yeah, but it was the Islamic thinkers and philosophers who really preserved Plato.
Now, Aristotle, I think, was preserved by the Irish monks and the English monks, but you can correct me. But why do we spend so much time on a fellow named Socrates who actually never wrote anything?
I think the reason why Socrates is so important is he's right there at the beginning of the serious inquiry into moral and political things. And so if you're right there at the beginning, you have to differentiate. You have to show or think through the foundations for everything that you're doing. You have to justify your radical questioning or the questions that you ask. And that means you have to justify yourself both against normal traditional assumptions that prevail in political life and also against, in Greece, a sort of tradition of science that had developed, but which wasn't completely political. So Socrates isn't the first philosopher, but he's the first moral and political philosopher. What they say is he's the first philosopher, Cicero famously says this, to inquire into the good and bad things, to bring philosophy down from the heavens into the cities and the households.
Yeah, what I love to remind people of, when they talk about Socrates, yes, he's a great teacher and a philosopher. He's also a warrior. And I believe he fought in 3 wars or 3 epic battles on the Athenian side, for which many people esteem him greatly. Am I right about that? Am I remembering enough correctly?
Yeah, he fought for Athens. I mean, when one reads Plato, one sees that wasn't really the core of his life. He wasn't seeking to go out and risk his life, but you had to as a citizen of the city. But he was a very tough and effective warrior. In particular, Plato reports courageous in retreat. That is to say, he was rational and cool-headed enough to look tough when others were running away and fleeing. Those are the people who are running that the Spartans are going to chase and stick. But Socrates looked tough and threatening, so they didn't mess with him when the Athenians were in retreat.
Now, I bring that up because Plato obviously knows his readers will know that Socrates was like them, citizen soldier, and that his philosophy is not disconnected from the fact Persia tried to crush Greece in his lifetime. So there's a regime that's invading another regime. So all of this stuff is very real in one sense. It's not unlike, I began the show today with Dr. Arnn, Lebanon, which is run by Hezbollah, which is run by Iran, has been shelling every day for 8 months Israel, and there's likely to be a war. It's not very different, and it isn't very far from where the Republic is conducted. I mean, it's very, very current.
One of the great things about Greek philosophy is, the greatest philosophers are in Athens, and there's no completely private life in Athens. Everyone is part of the regime. And so matters of what you're thinking, what you're saying, what you say about the gods, those are life and death matters. There are expectations that you serve in the assembly, in the army. If you don't, people raise questions. You can be killed for it. And in fact, the one thing everyone knows about Socrates is Athens forced him to drink hemlock. So philosophizing becomes a life and death matter about the most important issues.
So let's go to this book, The Republic of Plato. But it is featuring Socrates, and it's translated by a very famous political theorist, Allan Bloom. And we want people who want to read and work with us, along with us, to get this translation, the Bloom translation. This is the second edition. The introduction is by Adam Kirsch, who I do not know. I was blessed to hear Allan Bloom lecture once. Go ahead, tell me what about Mr. Kirsch?
Oh, I just say I think that's not useful. But Bloom wrote an excellent interpretive essay. I mean, one of the, often the interpretations, the essays that go along with these things aren't very helpful. But Bloom's is one of the very best commentaries on the Republic. One can disagree with bits of it, but it's a fine study of the Republic and quite helpful, I think. But the main reason to get the Bloom translation is it's still the most accurate. I mean, and it's the closest to what Plato actually wrote in the Greek. I would like somebody to go through and really nitpicky revise it some, but it's the best out there. So that's the one we want to use.
Do you believe, by the way, Professor, we now have AI. I haven't asked anyone this yet. I'm glad I'm asking you before I ask Dr. Arnn. If we said to AI, please translate from the ancient Greek an original translation of Plato, would you trust it at all?
No, no. I mean, I'm learning a bit from some of my friends and colleagues who really study this. AI is not highly intelligent. It's sort of it draws from everything out there, from the aggregate. So we'll always come up with an average or answer to something. So that's just in general. But then with the Greek, to really understand how to translate the Greek, you have to know the philosophical significance of the words. That is, you have to have a lifelong experience in thinking through what these things mean. There's no way a computer will do that. I mean, that's one of the things that maybe should give us hope, that it could never translate the Republic as well as a human being.
Allan Bloom makes quite a lot of the word music in his introductory, I think it's his first introduction, that previous translators had botched music because they didn't think it made any sense to the modern reader. And he went back to the word music when he was talking about one of the great influences on the city, the regime. And I wonder what AI would pick. I don't know how to do it, and I don't want to do it. But I wonder whether they would use music or that terrible translation. I mean, Bloom goes to town. Poor guy, he's still got tire tracks on his forehead that he talks about.
Yeah.
Well, do you use this in class? This is your translation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we spend nearly a whole semester reading the Republic. I mean, it's a great work, and it requires long, extensive study and wrestling with. But it's great fun too, of course. I mean, it's Socrates is so playful and radical, especially in that dialogue, that one cannot not enjoy reading. You know, what is arguably, I think, is the greatest work of philosophy. Yeah.
Now this 300 pages long, and so people just heard you say,
Yeah.
A semester on 300 pages? Really? Now, we did Plato in about 3 weeks.
That's
50
pretty
years
lazy.
ago. So how many people take that course? Is that 3-4 people, or is that packed?
Well, we can compel them to take the courses. Yeah, the classical class is popular. It's all the politics majors take it at some point. So it's 15, 20 students.
So give us a sense of how we're going to do this. Because when Dr. Arnn and you come back in about a month, we'll go over this again, and you two will be carrying the burden because I can't do this very well. But how should people begin to get ready for that in a month?
Well, I mean, start to read it slowly, maybe read it alongside Bloom's interpretive essay, not, taking Bloom as the final word on anything, but maybe helping to provoke thinking about the significance of some of what is there. Really, but working through it slowly and asking questions the whole time. Why is Socrates raising this issue? Why does it begin with him talking to an old man about what old age is like? Why, I've heard this is a dialogue about justice. What's the relevance of that? Why is the dialogue situated where it is? Why is Socrates compelled to speak? He says he doesn't want to have a conversation, then his friends, kind of force him to talk with them. So what could possibly be the significance of all of these playful details?
I am very interested in this opening section, because when I was a young man learning this, I didn't care what the old guy was asking. But now I'm very interested in what the senior citizen is talking about, as I hope Dr. Arnn is. So let's run through the characters. And by the way, you just said something, Daniel, which no one ever told me before, which is read the interpretive essay along with the text. I've always thought you had to finish the book first to then read the interpretive essay. You just turned that upside down. So how is that done?
Ideally, one wouldn't be reading a book like this with a commentary in hand, but I guess I'm thinking, answering your question honestly. If your viewers want to prepare, the thing with Plato is, more than other thinkers, you need a guide, and there are a lot of bad guides. Bloom is a pretty good guide. It's a very good guide in many ways. To really wrap your mind around the Platonic dialogue, you need somebody who really gets how to read Plato to kind of draw things out. So that's why I think it's helpful. Now, Bloom helpfully breaks down the sections of the dialogue in his commentary, so you can read a section of the Republic and then turn to the interpretive essay and back and forth. So it's pretty easy.
When I come back with
but again,
Dr. O'Toole, we're going to talk about the schedule that we will follow. And we haven't really etched it out other than we think it's going to take at least 16 weeks, which means it will probably take 30. And that's fine. That's fine. If you get this, if you get the bug, you can go get the book. And if you don't get the bug, go get the book anyway. The Republic of Plato, translated by Allan, Allan, Bloom. And I'll be right back with Professor O'Toole to wrap up this week's Hillsdale Dialogue.
Hi, I'm Benjamin Payne. At the K-12 Education Office at Hillsdale College, we support school founding groups and their efforts to start classical schools across the country. Finding the right leader is one of the first and most important steps to building a successful school. While we do consider experience in education, we seek candidates who exhibit unwavering personal integrity, honesty, courage, and servant-hearted leadership. Perhaps that's you. If you're looking to engage in fulfilling, impactful, and challenging work protecting our nation's future and building up the next generation of virtuous citizens, we'd love to hear from you. I'm looking for strong school leaders right now. Learn more about how you can make a difference at hillsdale.edu/leader. hillsdale.edu/LEADER. That's hillsdale.edu/leader.
Welcome back, America, to the Hillsdale Dialogue. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Professor Daniel O'Toole, who teaches at Hillsdale College, both ancient political philosophy, modern political philosophy, American Political Thought, joins me, and he'll be around a lot this year when Dr. Arnn and I finish up with World War I in a few weeks. We're going to turn to Plato and three of his dialogues, a long one, The Republic, and two others. But Dr. O'Toole, I just noticed during the break that the jobs report came out, right? Breaking news. Hiring blew past expectations, 272,000 jobs in May. Markets tanked because that means even though unemployment went up to 4%, interest rates are probably going to go higher because that's a hot economy. Why do people who care about headlines why ought they to care about the Republic?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think ultimately all of us want to live a life that's as serious and as intelligent and as moral as possible. And it seems to me that the Republic is the book that guides us about the most important things and our soul. And then the Republic, I think, is also the book that, again, shows us the true and fundamental character of political life and its limits, and what political life can and cannot be. And so it helps clarify our own situation in the world.
Almost certainly everyone who is listening to this has some involvement with or intent to become involved with politics at some level. And usually younger people have bigger plans and older people have more modest aims, but they probably plan on getting involved in politics. If they do so, they might think, especially if they're in Pittsburgh, that the Republic is about our republic. But it's not about our republic. It's, in fact, not about any republic, correct?
Yeah, it's about the nature of the regime. And it's, what happens in the dialogue is Socrates guides some young men in building a city in speech, which is, in a way, an ideal or a completely just regime. And this construction, what it helps reveal, I think, is what it is that human beings long for above all in political life. One thing that drives politics, not the only thing, but one thing that drives politics is a longing for justice, and to finally have a just regime in which everyone gets what he deserves, the task and job that he deserves, the education that he needs. We long for that, right? We want that. And so political idealism is a powerful political force. It can be an extremely dangerous political force. In fact, that's one of the things the dialogue teaches. So what Plato helps us see and bring out is the character of our own longings and the demands we make on politics, and the character of political idealism. And then what we're going to see is he ultimately shows you why, in a way, the perfectly just regime cannot be realized. So he shows you.
Professor, I want to ask you before we run out of time. We're going to have a website. I'll tell everyone where to go because you're going to design the readings that people can get to on a week-by-week basis. But I read some John Rawls back in the day, and Rawls had this wonderful construct: design your regime without knowing what your job's going to be or your position in it. Then you'll have a just regime. Do you think Plato would agree with that? It's always appealed to me.
No, I mean, Rawls asks you to abstract from your nature. And one of the great things about the way Plato interrogates things is he acknowledges that human beings are radically different, and we cannot abstract from our passions, our interests, and the differences, the great gulf between human abilities and what we're best fit for. Some of us are more spirited. Some of us are obviously more intelligent. And that means we're going to have different roles within life. You know, Rawls kind of wants to abstract from all of that so that we're all individuals who get to craft our own life plan with nothing holding us back. I think Plato's helpfully shows you why all of that is utopian and not possible.
Well, yeah, the gold, the silver, and the bronze soul, which we will get to. We got a couple of gold souls in Dr. O'Toole and Dr. Arnn, but they got a bronze interlocutor, so I'll keep it real for the rest of you. I'm sure I got to ask you one question. Did you put your hand up, or were you drafted for this?
It was a little bit of both. I mean, I'm very pleased to do it. You mentioned it, so you planted the idea in my mind back when we met a few months ago, and I was like, "Oh, that'd be great to do." But then Larry and I hadn't talked about it, and then you just mentioned it at the dinner table the other day. I was like, "Yeah, of course I'll do it." So I'm I love teaching Plato, so happy to chat about it with you.
Whenever a dean or a president has approached me at the law school to ask me to take on a new course, it always sounds fun at the beginning. Then you got to read the case. I mean, Adla, I did it once because it's just so dreadful. So at least you don't have to go and like reinvent the wheel here. But you will be picking. No one has to read the book from page 1 to 300, right? You're going to give us selections.
Well, you can. I would recommend reading the book from page 1 to 300. Yeah, we're going to spend a long time. But yeah, I'll spotlight key passages that we'll maybe read aloud and talk about.
I think we will.
You can have a sort of.
Would you very quickly give us the my pronunciation is horrible of this stuff. I can do Plato and Glaucon, and that's about it. We've got only about 15 characters in this thing. Who are we going to start with?
Well, we'll start, people disagree about how to pronounce these, but I'll say my pronunciations. Cephalus and Polemarchus, and then Glaucon and Adeimantus, the brothers of Plato, and Thrasymachus, the great sophist, the critic of justice.
We'll go back all over that, and we will all agree upon a pronunciation by the end of this.
Thanks for listening to the Hillsdale Dialogues, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. For more information about Hillsdale College, head to hillsdale.edu.